publication that's dedicated just to analyzing and trying to better understand and appreciate the storytelling in video games. That's all we do. It's what our panels at PAX are about. So if you like what you see here, feel free to check us out online. I'm so happy to see so many of you here. I hope you're having an awesome PAX so far. We're going to try to make the next hour awesome for you too. I'm here with my friends and colleagues from the site. We've got Layla Carter, Jaron R.M. Johnson, and CJ Thomas. We're going to be talking with you about every aspect of serialized storytelling in video games. So if you have been to PAX, or have otherwise simply been playing video games for the last few years, you know that video games are doing all sorts of things with spreading out stories into some kind of episode in one form or another, whether that's something like the Telltale games, something like DLC, something more generic and traditional, like simply having a long-running series of video game stories like The Legend of Zelda, and now like The Legend of Zelda has DLC. So we wanted to take this opportunity to talk a little bit just about the extent to which all of this serialization of video game storytelling may or may not be making new kinds of storytelling possible in video games. If you're here, I hope you'll agree with me that video games as a medium quite generally is able to do things in storytelling that other media simply can't, or on the other hand, might just be bad at. What I want to do is focus in even closer and say, all right, given that video games are able to do interesting and unique things in storytelling, what is it that the serialization of video games affords storytelling? So roadmap for what we're going to be doing here, I'm going to be talking with you for about 15 minutes about DLC specifically and how that may or may not be impacting the storytelling of video games. Then I'm going to kick it over to CJ and Jaron. They're going to talk about how to understand the series of video games and what the principles are that unify different entries in the series. And they're going to talk about that for about 15 minutes. Layla's going to pick it up from there and talk for about 15 minutes about the influence of mythology in video games and how it might be the case that many games that you don't think of as part of a series, in fact, are part of the longest running series in the world. And then after that, we're going to leave some time, hopefully for Q&A in the room. Afterwards, we'd love to keep the conversation going and talk with you all, so if you're interested in chatting with us, we'll be hanging out right outside, and we want to talk to you for as long as you're interested. Well, like I said, I'm going to be starting with DLC, and I'll start with a confession. Maybe like some of you, when DLC first started becoming a thing, I was really nervous and upset about it because I thought it was going to be a simple cash grab for the industry, a way to bump up the price of games from 60 bucks to 80 bucks, maybe even to 100 bucks. I didn't think we'd be able to offer anything really new to the medium, and that was really frustrating and disappointing to me as someone who cares a lot about the story of video games. So I actually set out to kind of try to prove that there's no way in which DLC could contribute something new to the storytelling of video games. And as has often been the case over the years as I've been working on video games, a little company called From Software ended up proving me wrong. Anyone heard of From Software? How about this? Anyone heard of Dark Souls? They're the people behind that little franchise that you may or may not be familiar with. Yeah, so what I want to do in this first part of the presentation is chat with you first about why I thought DLC was never going to do anything new and interesting for video game storytelling, and then I'm going to jump into specifically the first DLC from Dark Souls 3 and tell you why that convinced me that I was wrong and that we should be excited for DLC as a mode of storytelling. First, we got to talk about exactly what DLC is, because the moniker downloadable content can cover so many things, and does cover so many things today. Because we're just interested in thinking about storytelling here, I'm going to be thinking just about that DLC which purports to extend the story of the main game, or if you prefer the term base game, in some way. And it's important to think about what we mean by extending the story, because I'm not talking about something like a sequel or a prequel that either starts before the story of the main game or otherwise picks up on the events following the end of the main game. Rather, I'm interested in this kind of DLC that's very popular these days, where it just tries to add more events or characters or worlds to the existing story of the main game. I have a couple examples up here of such DLC. I'm sure you can pick your own examples too if you prefer, but we'll be jumping back into these examples specifically in a moment. This is the question that I wanted to focus on. Put a bit more precisely than I was saying before. Is there any kind of story that just needs to be told as DLC, right? Because if we're really trying to hone in on and answer the question, is DLC justifiable as a storytelling medium, this struck me as a good way to go into it, right? So it's not just the question, can a good story happen to be told in DLC form? That seems kind of obviously true to me, as long as there are some good stories out there. Of course, you can stick it in a DLC and be satisfied with it. Rather, the question is, just like there are some stories that either need to be told or are most successful when told through the medium of video games, right? Are there any stories that just have to be told as DLC? And in that sense, are DLC contributing anything really new to the mode of storytelling more generally? This is why I really thought that was just a hard no. And it's something that I want to call the completeness dilemma. The idea is that there are only two possibilities for how game stories can go, and in either way, DLC would not function as a mode of storytelling, right? So think about the idea of a video game story, or a story more generally, being complete, right? And the only thing I have in mind there is the idea that when we're looking at a really good story, especially in something like a game, which is so decision and interaction based, a story feels really complete and coherent when all of its pieces hang together in a really satisfying way, right? So it's almost like the world represents a closed system where everything is really responsive to the player's choice and everything contributes to a broader story theme in a really compelling way. If a story is complete like that, though, you would think that there's no way to kind of extend the story and reach beyond it because it's already complete, right? So if you have a really satisfying story that's complete in this sense, it doesn't seem like DLC would be possible, right? On the other hand, the other possibility is that the story of a main game could be incomplete, right? Its parts don't hang together really well. Maybe it has one interesting theme, but a lot of aspects of the story don't contribute to that theme. And so in that case, you could say, well, hey, DLC is possible because it can, contribute to the story and extend it by completing it because it wasn't complete before, right? But in that sense, it still doesn't seem as if DLC is justified as its own medium of storytelling. It seems like instead what we're saying is just, here in this DLC is some content that really should have been in the main game in the first place, right? The developer should have done their job and put it back in there in the first instance, right? So in that sense, this is the dilemma that I'm after. I'm thinking, all right, either a game story is complete or incomplete, and in either case, DLC is not going to be possible in a way that really adds something new to storytelling quite generally. And I think this dilemma beyond theory actually pans out in practice when we look at the DLC that's out there, right? So now I'm going to dive into these examples, but again, if you haven't played these games, you can probably think of your own. Dishonored, I personally hold up as a game that I think has a very coherent and compelling and complete story. I think all of the aspects in the world of Dishonored are really bent towards the actions that you make as your avatar Corvo, and the whole thing seems really satisfying in exactly the way you would want a story to be. And when you look at the DLC of the first Dishonored, it kind of pans out that it wasn't possible to extend the main story in a really convincing way. What they do instead is they put you in the perspective of a different character, this assassin Dowd whom you encounter in the main game, and you have him play basically a parallel series of events to the main story, right? And so even though it's kind of stipulatively happening in the world of Dishonored, right, you don't get the sense playing it that it's actually contributing something new to the story that you experienced in Dishonored. It just seems like kind of another story that's only nominally related to Dishonored, right? Which reinforces the idea, I think, that DLC that could extend the story of an already complete story is impossible. On the other hand, take something like Dark Souls 2, all right? Some of you might be familiar with Dark Souls 2 and Scholar of the First Sin, right? And something that I think is really interesting about this is if you look for Dark Souls 2 on the market these days, it's pretty hard to find a copy of it that doesn't have the DLC, Scholar of the First Sin, precisely because, I think, they released the DLC and fans had this response of, oh yes, this is what was missing from the main game of Dark Souls 2. I thought I was just dissatisfied with Dark Souls 2 because it was a bad game or it wasn't as good as the first Dark Souls, but really the problem was just that it was incomplete. And once they released this DLC, the game became better because they were able to actually complete it and connect it to the other games and the lore in a more satisfying way. So again, this is just a concrete example showing us that same completeness dilemma that we were talking about before and leading us to worry that DLC could not contribute something new and compelling to the medium. Like I said, I had this idea turned on its head by From Software, the very company that put out Dark Souls 2 and Scholar of the First Sin when they released Dark Souls 3 and its DLC. So I'm going to walk you through an example of how they showed me something really interesting that I think actually reaches beyond the application of DLC, which is that if you're a storyteller and you're met with a limitation in your storytelling medium, whether that's the completeness dilemma in DLC or something else entirely, an interesting and really compelling way to get around that limitation is to tell a story that is in fact deeply about that limitation. So I'm going to dive in and talk about this principle with regard to the first DLC of Dark Souls 3, like I said, but I don't think this is the only example of it. It's just an especially well put one, so I encourage you to look out for this elsewhere. Before I get into it, let me just take a straw poll. How many people have actually played Ashes Very End? Okay, that's healthy, that's good. It's great, and you should play it. I'm going to avoid diving into Dark Souls lore for two reasons. First, we would be here for the rest of PAX, not just today, the entire convention. I'm not going to monopolize it time that much. The other reason is that, I think the broad strokes of this example are pretty compelling on their own terms, and so by just seeing the broad strokes, everyone will be able to really get into this example and appreciate it a little bit more. So, to give you a brief recap of Dark Souls 3, at the very base level, it's the kind of story that you encounter in all sorts of DLCs, in all sorts of RPGs, rather, forgive me. The story is just, you're a hero who has a special ability to save the world, you have the power of fire, and the whole storyline is about fulfilling your duty in that world in some sense. There are multiple endings, but all of them are grounded in the idea of there's something that has to happen in that world, and you are the only one who can do it, right? That's really all we need to know about Dark Souls 3 for this example to work. So now, go to Ashes Very End, all right? This is a DLC, this is something that players had to decide to purchase, right? And it's very easy for a developer to simply, give players a DLC and let them immediately access it in the game, sort of force them into it with a cutscene or something. From Software does the exact opposite of that. They introduce you to the DLC by putting a very easy-to-miss NPC in the world of the main Dark Souls 3 game. This is him, Slave Knight Gale, lying prostrate by a bonfire in Dark Souls 3, right? And so the first thing to notice is that from the very outset, before you've even entered the DLC, From Software is giving you a choice. You have to make an active decision to play this DLC. And when you encounter Slave Knight Gale and talk to him, he says something along the lines of this. Hey, I know you're busy doing other stuff, your duty or whatever, but there's this other world, right, that I'm really invested in. It's really rotten and messed up, and I feel like you could fix it. Would you be into doing that? And again, he doesn't just pull you into it. You have to actually say, yes, okay, I'll do that. And that's the point at which he'll basically suck you into what is literally another world of art. That is a world that is contained within this little scrap of painting that he has, and that's how you enter the painted world of Ariandel. So the immediate thing to notice is that even from the outset with this DLC, the content of the DLC story is mirroring exactly what it is for the player to decide to buy and engage with the DLC. You have this world, this coherent experience that you've already had with the main game, and you're deciding, yes, I'm actually going to try to find a way to step beyond this world and engage with something else, exactly as a player does when she decides to play DLC. So say you decide to enter this world, all right, pretty early on, you're met with this NPC who sort of serves as the arbiter of this world. Her name is Sister Frida. She's affiliated with this church who has this long, deep related lore in the rest of the series. And she basically says as much as this, hey, I'm not really sure how you got here, but you shouldn't be here and you should leave. And there's actually a bonfire which is used for teleportation throughout the game right next to her. She'll point to it and say, hey, it's fine that you're here, but there's a way out, you should take it because this world has nothing to do with you. Right? And so again, once you're in the DLC, it's reinforcing the idea that something is amiss with your decision to be engaging with this other world, right? You have a duty inherent to the main game, and you are stepping beyond it in a way that is kind of unnatural. And the unnatural nature of it is emphasized even more as you get deeper into the DLC. This is Sir Wilhelm. He sort of stands guard over Sister Frida. The first thing he'll say to you is, hey, you should listen to that Sister Frida. You should get out of here. But of course you're not going to, right? So you don't listen to him, and you go about your merry way in the DLC, and so eventually he'll come upon you again, but now he's an enemy. And he'll say something along the lines of, I warned you, and now I'm gonna have to kill you. But he says more than that. He says something that is really interesting and compelling commentary, I think, not only on this nature of meaningful DLC that I'm telling you about, but also just about people who play video games and Dark Souls especially, which is on the screen, but he basically says, look, you're a ridiculous kind of person who just needs to uncover every single last thing, even if it has nothing to do with you. Which again is the whole point of this DLC. It is not germane to the duty or the quest of the avatar as whom you're playing. In fact, it doesn't even exist in the same world. And he wants to get that through your head, and he wants to eventually punish you for refusing to listen to that. He's insisting that you're doing something unnatural in the same way that a player who is really satisfied with a deeply coherent story does something unnatural by wanting more of it, even though they're so satisfied that it was coherent in the first place and couldn't support any kind of extension to its story. And it carries right through to the end of the DLC. At this point, I'm really just hammering the same idea into your head to show you how entrenched this idea really is in Ash's Very Andal. But at the end of the DLC, From Software does a very Dark Souls thing, where once you open the chamber in which you'll fight the final boss, this giant hall, which is right beneath where you first encountered Sister Frida, you're able to enter that chamber and just walk right up to the final boss without the boss fight starting. It's not as if a cutscene immediately happens and then you're thrust into the fight. You literally have to make the decision and reaffirm your choice to play this DLC over and over again by walking the entire length of this massive hall and then choosing to interact with Father Ariandel, the final boss. And it's only after you insist on your unnatural curiosity to that extent that the boss fight will begin, Sister Frida will join him, and if she manages to kill you, she'll insist on the same point. You should really go back to where you belong because, again, this world has nothing to do with you. Why is that so interesting, and how does it allow us to avoid the completeness dilemma? Well, notice, as I said at the outset of this example, what they're doing is they're really telling a story that is deeply about the completeness dilemma and about sort of the underlying motivations of a player that have caused this interesting paradox. When we play a game, of course we want it to have a compelling story. Of course we want it to engage with us. We want it to tell the kind of story where every aspect of the world really contributes to that story, and it's not as if we need to be hunting for the story in a broader world that has nothing to do with it, right? But at the same time, when we find something that's so complete and so interesting, we want more of it, even though there's something deeply paradoxical about that, right? We try to reach beyond the very world that satisfied us so much in the first place. And there is something kind of unnatural and even perverse about that the story of Ash's Very Andal focuses heavily on. It's the same idea which is used so successfully by mirroring the motivations of the player with the motivations of the avatar, where both of them have sort of a duty and purpose to the main world of the game. That was how they happened upon the world in the first place. They have a very well-defined reason for being there and a goal in that world, and yet they've made this weird decision to go beyond it, to try to find this other world. And this is the kind of story that could only work in a DLC. You could not just try to bake this into the main game in the first place, because one of the reasons why it works so well is precisely because the player has made this unnatural decision to try to get more out of an already complete game. And by doing that, From Software is able to actually tell a story that could only work as DLC and set the standard for more stories that could work only as DLC in the future. And in fact, they've already done this. I wrote an article about this, and if you're interested in what I just talked about, I think you can say the exact same thing for Bloodborne's DLC, which is also fantastic if you haven't played that. So check that out. But the takeaway, right, I think it's so easy to think of DLC as a mere cash grab, and I emphasize I think it often is. But why this gave me hope is that I think there are ways in which it can be more than a cash grab, and I think that as developers try to find more ways to make the stories of DLC compelling, they'll probably end up gravitating towards things like this more and more. So I want to thank you for that, for listening.
Again, my name is Sharon Arne Johnson. I am an analyst for With a Terrible Fate.
And I am CJ Thomas. I'm also an analyst for The Terrible Fate.
And we are going to be talking to you guys a little bit about unifying series. We're going to be talking about how you unify a series, how series writers unify their own work, and how you, as either a fan or a writer of a series, can kind of introduce a new chapter successfully into an already existing series. We're going to be talking primarily first about chronology, which is like timelines, and how people mostly use chronology as a method for unifying a series. This would be, kind of letting one series just chronologically take place right after the other one. It's one of the most popular ways people do sequels. We're going to be addressing some of the challenges that there are with this concept and why it's maybe not the best way to do it. We're also going to be talking about a couple of the alternative methods that some folks use to unify a series, which would be the theme of the series, the setting of the series, and the player's role in that series, which is unique to video games. And then we'll give you guys some use cases for these. So, who here likes Mario? Great. We're going to be talking about Zelda. So this, I think a lot of you guys are familiar with this if you like Zelda. This is the timeline. This timeline was introduced in the Hyrule Historia in 2011 of detailed the history of the world of Zelda chronologically through the game's releases. And a lot of people love this timeline, a lot of people don't love this timeline. It's pretty divisive, but it was treated when it came out as being canon. It's definitely part of the universe. Now, the fans saw a lot of these recurring themes, and they said, we do want more. We like this timeline. We want to use it to kind of influence our understanding of the series. We want to use it to understand not only games that already exist, but to kind of help us guess and guide where the next games in the series are going to be. A lot of fans will do these theories on different Reddits. This is a really popular subreddit for theories, True Zelda. You will almost always see people referencing the timeline here. This is the primary method of discussion for what happens in the lore. People tend to just kind of take this timeline and say, hey, if it's this way in this game and it's this way in this game, it's probably this way in this game for this particular reason. This is a pretty common thing for Zelda fans, but it's also used for Zelda fans to not only generate ideas about the canon of the series, but also to generate some of their own fan content. You see things like short films or short stories. Colin and I actually have an article on the series called Hero of Time, where we're using that timeline, a couple of different sources for canon information to kind of use an almost analytical version of fan fiction to start looking at the gap in time between Majora's Mask and Twilight Princess. Unfortunately, for a lot of fans, and something that we discovered in writing this series, this timeline is very fallible. It has a massive problem in it, and that is that the developers don't really view it as being as important as the fans do. In 2017, last February, Eiji Aonuma did an interview with Game Informer where he essentially explains that when they were working on Breath of the Wild and when they work on these Zelda games, they don't really look at the timeline. They say that they don't want to be chained up and be required to follow along with the timeline. They would much rather just make an enjoyable game and kind of leave it to the fans to do the heavy lifting and put that somewhere into the timeline, which tells us as fans that this timeline is no better than the fan fiction series that Colin and I are writing. It isn't used to guide the series in any way within the canon, and so for us it's not usable to sort of guess at what is happening in Breath of the Wild. There really is no answer to where is Breath of the Wild in the timeline because the developers never made that decision for themselves. So if Breath of the Wild isn't in the chronology, and if they've stated flat out that Breath of the Wild isn't in the chronology and that they don't know where it is, how do we even know that Breath of the Wild is a Zelda? How do we know that, the title, right? How do we know? Take away the title, how do you know when you play this game?
What's the title?
What is a title? How do you know that it's a Zelda? What elements kind of help you understand when you play it, like, yeah, this is definitely a Zelda game and I can tell. That is where those alternative methods for series unification sort of come into play.
So when we say unifying the series, first of all, there are two little caveats there. One of them is that when we say unifying the series, we just mean how do we make multiple entries of a series identifiable with one another? How do we identify this collection of works as a series? And again, that's aside from them all being named the same thing. The other caveat there is that with multiple methods of series unification, that they aren't mutually exclusive to one another. So that a series that has a timeline and a canon can also use other things that bind their different entries together. And a good example is like Star Wars has a canon, but also Star Wars has themes that if you took the themes out of a Star Wars movie, is it really a Star Wars movie? Things like that. So the first thing that we're going to discuss then is unification by theme. And my example here is Shadowrun. Shadowrun is a very, very old game. It's also a really interesting game. It's about like, you can play as humans, dwarves, elves, there's magic, but it's also all set in this futuristic cyberpunk universe. So there's a really interesting melding of fantasy and science fiction there. And originally, if you look over there on the left, the original Shadowrun was a rulebook for a tabletop game, and later it became a turn-based strategy game. And the most recent Shadowrun Returns game is also turn-based strategy. It was Shadowrun Returns as in returns to form. But the one that I'm always interested in is the weird one here. The one right here. This is the Shadowrun that says Games for Windows from 2009. Has anyone ever played this game?
So you know.
So you know my game. first-person shooter, arena shooter, with no campaign. It's multiplayer only. And so the big question is, how do we know that that's a Shadowrun game? And it's because it shares the same themes that other Shadowrun games has. It's the same melding of fantasy and futurism. It's the same, dark dystopia of rebels fighting against an unfeeling, uncaring corporation trying to basically suck out their souls. It's all of that.
It's a game about EA.
Oh my God. So our next bit is setting. Where are we? Where is this, guys? Skyrim. I was 50-50 on that one, but yeah, this is Skyrim from the Elder Scrolls series. So the Elder Scrolls series is an excellent example of games that identify by their setting. All of the Elder Scrolls games take place on this continent of Tamriel, of which Skyrim is a part. And the setting, the peoples who live on Tamriel, the culture of Tamriel, the religion of Tamriel, and even in the geographic locations of Tamriel, those are the mainstay of that series. And so much so that they named each of the games after locations in the series. Skyrim takes place in Skyrim. Morrowind takes place in Morrowind. Oblivion, it takes place in Hell. I mean Cyrodiil. And also in a place called Oblivion. And that's important then. There is a canon in the Elder Scrolls series, but that canon is not nearly as important to the developers as continuing to work with their setting is in their series, at least in my humble opinion. Our last method of unification is the presence of the player, which we'll talk about Fable. So Fable was one of the I don't get it. What's the joke here? So Fable was one of the original games I guess not the original, but it was one of the first games I think in the Xbox 360 era that really tried to emphasize choice, consequence, morality, but all of that is super heavy, super dependent on the presence of the player. So much so that all of the most pivotal plot points of the game are dependent on your choices as the player. In a sense, there is no plot without you, which I think is personally kind of cool. And a Fable game would have a really tough time identifying itself as a Fable game if it wasn't heavily dependent on the choices of the player. Fable Legends. So a good question to go from there is, why do we have these alternative methods for unifying a different series? So to kind of go back to our Fable question here, in Fable, one of the things that you run into is that Fable 2, for instance, has multiple endings. The very end of the game, you encounter the giant tower thing that lets you grant wishes. You have a choice of 3 different wishes. One of them is kill everyone. Or let everyone stay dead. That was one. I killed everyone myself.
Yeah, there's actually a good arc that you can do, and be a good person. He never played it, but it exists.
No. Big horns. So that begs the question, what happens if I do the evil ending? What about the side quests? What happens if I did or did not do those side quests? How does that affect the next iteration of that game? How does that affect Fable 3? And there are games that have canon answers to do that, but there are other games that simply don't answer those questions because they have these alternative methods of identifying different members of their series. The Elder Scrolls, for instance, will simply move locations most of the time to make the choices of the previous game more or less irrelevant. And Skyrim, for instance, is 200 years in the future. So they move so that your previous choices they just don't matter, which is fine with me. No one wants to remember how many people I killed. Other games like Mass Effect will in fact build large stories that are they're big enough to accommodate all the different choices that you can make throughout each game. And Mass Effect was in fact really big on making sure that you could save those choices and continue on with the exact same story every single game.
Otherwise, you would miss the giant letdown of being team of writers and a long spanning series like, for example, Zelda, you'll notice that it's rarely the same set of writers from game to game. These writers change hands from game to game. Sometimes they change hands within the development of the same game. So with changing hands of writers, you'll see that a lot of people will kind of, as writers, they'll do some setup, they'll say, hey, I'm going to bring this up now so that I can address it later. And then in the next iteration of the series, no one picks up those loose ends. No one ties them up. And so they're just kind of left dangling as unfinished bits of lore. This is a very common problem in video games. And it's also a problem in video games because video games have this unique storytelling element that films, movies, books don't have to consider, and that is the role of the player in the narrative and how the player can interact within the narrative. So, like Colin said, games like Mass Effect have a lot of narrative to consider. So the script for a game like Mass Effect would be much longer than the script for, say, a Telltale series because they have to follow along every single path for the choose-your-own-adventure that is those 3 games. Excuse me. So, like we said with the Zelda series has changed writers a lot. Some of the games were fantastic, some of the games had great commercial success, like Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. Some of the games were not so good, like Skyward Sword. And you'll see that when you kind of take all these things into account, right, it brings us back to the question. So now we know all these alternative methods, right? We can start to readdress the question is, how do we know if Breath of the Wild is actually a Zelda game?
So to go back through our different methods of unification, excuse me, the first way we know is because it follows the same themes of Legend of Zelda, such as the freedom to roam around the overworld and to basically address the main quests at your own pace. Also, constant themes of reincarnation and cyclical storytelling are really common in Legend of Zelda. And then on a gameplay level, one of the themes that they incorporate in gameplay is puzzle solving, critical thinking. And these are all really important ways to make a Zelda game identifiable without busting the title up in the very beginning.
We also have elements of the setting. And like Colin said, none of these are mutually exclusive. You don't need all of these together all the time. Primarily, a lot of the Zelda games that have been coming out recently take place in Hyrule or some iteration of Hyrule, right? There are obvious exceptions to that. Four Swords Adventures games, Minish Cap, those don't take place in Hyrule. But they still have other elements of the Hyrule and the Zelda mythology, right? You have the concept of these 3 goddesses, or the goddess highlighted, depending on the line of logic. You have the Master Sword, or some legendary weapon that is the bane of evil, right? It's the one thing that you need to defeat the last boss of the game. You have the Fairy Fountains, these shrine elements that you see a lot in Twilight Princess. These are all present in Breath of the Wild, which kind of tells us, yeah, this is for sure a Zelda. And then finally, we have the player's role. The player in the Zelda games operate entirely through their avatar, and so that in that way, the avatar almost doesn't exist. You are Link when you play the story, right? Link is a blank slate character. And Layla's going to be talking a little bit more about that, so I won't go too in depth, but essentially, Link is meant to be a character that you just project yourself onto. This is done successfully in a lot of books. It's a very common thing, especially for video games, because it allows you to feel very immersed in the story that you're playing. Link also largely doesn't have any dialogue in most of the games, which allows you as the player to have sort of imaginative control over what Link says. You get to kind of think in your head like, well, based on the NPC's response, Link probably said this. And that's all for you to decide in your own head. So when we kind of look at all these things together, we can pretty decisively say that, yeah, Breath of the Wild is for sure a Zelda game. And in our opinions, it's a pretty great one. It was a step in a lot of weird directions. Nobody had ever really played a game like Breath of the Wild. But, using all these alternative methods for series unification, you kind of bring it all together and say, yeah, this does, in our opinion, feel like a Zelda game. Thanks, guys, for listening to this one. I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Layla. She's going to share some stuff with you about
So, you guys all know what folklore and mythology is. They're ancient forms of storytelling that affected modern-day storytelling, including tropes, archetypes, and plots. And many of these stories still exist today, and they're so pervasive in our media, mostly because a lot of creative minds feel the need to retell the stories over and over again, but with different twists, right? And these twists are possible because in most mythology, there's this thing called blank space. It's basically this emptiness upon character that the myth kind of just ignores. So there's no explanation to things. Gods just do what they want because they're gods. Humans don't really have this deep personal struggle that's explained. And essentially the why of a lot of actions just are left unanswered. Like we don't know why things happen, they just happen. So essentially what a lot of authors and creative minds do is they see these myths and say, okay, that's nice and all, but what if I decide to fill in the blank space with things that I think might have happened? And essentially, retelling mythology is filling in the blank space. Okay, and these are different versions. These are different stories that you see throughout, all throughout video game life, like God of War, or even Disney movies like Aladdin, right? So essentially, I like to dub this thing called the Mythic Series. It's all mythological stories pertaining to a specific mythology or area, such as Greek or Norse, Arabian, things like that. But it also includes lists of works that involve or refer to the original myths in any way. I put a bunch of examples on the board. I'm not going over them, but a good example is Thor. Stanley literally looked at Norse mythology and said, okay, great, but what if I make him an alien? And essentially from his born. In my presentation, I'm going to show you how Okami fits into the Japanese Mythic Series because it's a retelling of several Japanese myths, as well as new interpretations to mythic figures and plot. So I know what you're thinking. So this is essentially fan fiction, right? Like we're just making stories up based on the original. I'm going to argue with you, no, it's not exactly fan fiction for several reasons. First, fan fiction is non-canon for good reasons, mostly. Since mythology, however, is not owned, a lot of interpretations actually can be considered as canon. And also, due to the nature of mythology, the stories keep changing over time, over thousands of years. So there's no, in a sense, an original story because it has always been changing throughout the course of time, right? The second reason as to why Mythic Series and fan fiction are a little different is that if you want to really analyze a myth or a character in a myth, you can't do this without looking at both the original story and many of the interpretations that follow. So you remember when I was like briefly going over archetypes and tropes? This is why these are important. In order to study myth or mythic retellings, you have to analyze all the different versions in order to get a complete understanding. And this can't be said for fan fiction. So for example, you have to know Greek mythology in order to really understand what the hell is happening in God of War. Or vice versa, when you study the Arabian Nights and look at the story of Aladdin, you're not going to get the Disney version out of your head. It's just going to always be there. So in order to understand Okami as part of the Mythic Series, we have to look at the original to get a complete picture of Mythic Japan. You cannot separate the two or else you lose meaning and fail to see how Okami fits in the Japanese Mythic Series. So I'm going to be brief. This is one of the original stories in Okami, and it's just important to, I guess, my thesis of this presentation. So essentially, Amaterasu is the goddess of the sun, the goddess of life, and her brother, Susanoo, is the storm god, their brother-sister. Kushinada is a mortal girl with 7 sisters who were eaten by an 8-headed monster. So one day, Susanoo is being a total mess and destroying everything, so Amy's like, that's it, you need to get the hell out. And so she kicks him out onto Earth, and on Earth, Susanoo finds Kushinada crying, because Orichi is going to kill her, as well as her other 7 sisters. And Susanoo says, I'll kill Orichi if you marry me. Everyone agrees, and he does so. So today, yay, Susanoo! So if you play the game Okami, you'll notice 2 things. One, Amaterasu is now the star of this show. The game makes it so that she does most of the work and saves Japan from Orichi. You have to help Susanoo throughout. He thinks he's brought down to the human level. Susanoo is now a drunk man, not a god. And you, Amaterasu, even though the avatar is technically a god, she is more or less human because she is the player's avatar. And you, the player, are human, I think. So how does the game do this? How does the game look at a god character and say, you know what, we're going to bring them down to the human level? Well, they design it essentially by making Amaterasu a blank character. Remember that blank space thing I was just talking about earlier? Well, essentially, the game designers looked at that and said, okay, we're going to give Ami more blank space so that the player can fill it up and can complete it. Because in the game, Amaterasu has little to no personality, and her reason to say Japan is barely given, other than she is good and she is evil. But other than that, you have no idea why she's saving Japan. And yeah, it's basically like Link from Legend of Zelda. She's a self-insert character. Because blank characters in games act the same to blank space in mythology, just with an added layer. You, the player, get to determine what the avatar's thinking, how they react to the world, and the motivation behind their actions. The designers made her a blank character so the players feel like they become the avatar. So they fill the blank space up with you in the myth. So, because of this, she is Amaterasu as your avatar, becomes the tools for you to experience mythological Japan, right? She is the means in which you get to enter the myth and do your thing, essentially. So, in order to put the player in blank space, the designers essentially had to make a huge change to the plot and make Amaterasu the main character and shift the focus away from the brother. Like, why did they do this, however? Why did they decide to change the plot so drastically? Well, essentially, they looked back at one of the main sources of Japanese mythology, which is the Kojiki, and it gives the original context to who Amaterasu is. She is the best goddess in Japanese mythology and Shinto religion. She's a mother goddess, sun goddess, goddess of life and energy. Nothing would exist or continue to exist without her being around. And context-wise, she was established this way so the Yamato clan could prove their dominance over other clans. They basically said, hey, we're descended from Amaterasu. The Kojiki says this, so all of you have to worship us. That's essentially how that went. And in the Kojiki, all other gods revere her and acknowledge her as the mother goddess who sustains life. She's the main source of life. And the creators of Okami saw this and said, okay, so she has to be the main character, else this is not going to work. Yeah, so essentially, Amaterasu is the best goddess, and it is only through her life-enabling power that Japan can be revived into a country full of life and beauty. No other god is capable of doing this. The game Okami then gives you, the player, the essential role of saving Japan. You are the best, and you're the only one who can try it, aka being the game, right? So what does this mean in terms of Okami being added to the Mythic Series? Well, it means that one, Okami is a retelling of a myth that brings a version of the Susanoo and Kushinami myth, where Amaterasu, the best goddess, is actually saves the day. But also, since you have become Amaterasu through the blank space of the myth, Okami has a version where you get to save Japan and experience the mythos that has been created for thousands of years. Now you can look back and you don't have to ask, well, what did the goddess do in the story? What does she decide? What does she do? It's more, what did I do in the story? How did I save Japan? What did I do that was so special? Right? Your playthrough of the game is now part of the Japanese Mythic Series. Now, when you go back and look at the goddess Amaterasu as a whole, when you analyze the original mythology and all the different interpretations of Amaterasu, you can include yourself. Okami makes this so you are an essential part of the Japanese Mythic Series because if you beat the game, you were the one who ultimately saved Japan and completed the myth, right? You can put that one on your resume. All right, that's it for my presentation. I'm going to hand it back over to Aaron.
Thank you, awesome audience. I hope you really enjoyed this. We're going to transition to Q&A, but before we do that, we would just love to take a selfie with you because you are such an awesome crowd, and we would love to memorialize you as well, if you're cool with that. So 1 minute, and then we're going to go to Q&A. Smile! All right. You, sir, welcome. And why don't we have you all say your name before you chat us up?
All right, so my name is Brian.
Hey, Brian.
My question is, so you talk a lot about fairly traditional ways of storytelling to maintain a series. Do you think it would be possible or know an example where a game so it's just gameplay to define a series and maintain a narrative that way?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question just a little louder?
Is there a way or an example that you know of where you think it's possible for a game to use gameplay to maintain a series narrative?
Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, one interesting example that comes to mind for me is, people debate a lot about whether there's some way to like include Bloodborne in the Dark Souls games, right? I think trying to do that in terms of connecting events in the games is kind of silly, but one really natural way to connect them is exactly as you say, saying, hey, they have really similar kinds of gameplay, so we can still kind of think of them as a series in that regard. And I think that's really why people will oftentimes just shorten the two series names to Soulsborne, right? Because they are unified by gameplay in exactly that way. Or something like the Mario series, right? I mean, many of the games have other like thematic relations or things like this, but really one might think that at bottom is the gameplay that defines them.
I think based on the example I gave earlier of games that go across multiple types of gameplay, I think gameplay might be, it is one of the ways that you can identify a series. I don't think it's one of the strongest methods. What comes to mind for me is playing Halo. I used to love playing Halo back when I was in high school, and I think a lot of the complaints that would crop up over the years as Halo evolved was, no, it's just Call of Duty, and they weren't wrong. But that was kind of one of the identifications that small changes to the gameplay of Halo had ripple effects that the developers may have intended, or maybe they didn't intend those ripple effects. They had caused drastic changes in tone and pace that eventually caused people to feel like it's Call of Duty now. So yeah, there's a little bit of credence to that.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Katie.
Hi, Katie.
Thinking specifically of Dark Souls, I was wondering, I feel like I learned a lot about the story through loading screens, and I was wondering, what do you think about loading screens as a medium for storytelling? Because I feel like if I missed those screens, I wouldn't know like really critical parts of the story.
Have you played Spec Ops?
Sorry?
Have you played Spec Ops The Line?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so the TLDR answer is yes. I think loading screens are an amazing example of an aspect of video games that can totally be a great tool for storytelling and are still underutilized. One of the really cool things about this game, Spec Ops, quick poll, anyone played Spec Ops in the room? Alright, so y'all know what I'm talking about, right? Spec Ops is this game where it's very much like Apocalypse Now and Heart of Darkness, where you're a soldier who sort of slowly like goes insane by the horrors of war, right? You play as him, right? So one of the interesting things that happens over the course of the game is you end up making more and more morally corrupt choices, and the loading screens actually start saying really weird things. They start diverging from normal things, like reminding you about certain gameplay commands and saying things like, you're still a good person, no matter how many people you killed, and that's really haunting, right? I think about this, I think about game tutorials too. I think a lot of the elements in games that seem really procedural right now, as the medium develops more and developers start playing with those things more, they're going to become some of the most essentially interesting aspects of the way that video games can tell stories that other media wouldn't be able to. The kind of elements that really interact and guide the player, right? Because the player is what makes video games so interesting in the first place. Okay. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Chris.
Hey, Chris.
One thing that I was interested about when you guys were talking about the completeness effect, and one of the games that I immediately thought of was Fallout 3, and how it kind of falls under both sides of the spectrum. In like the two examples I would use, Broken Steel and The Pit. As a player personally, I didn't really care much for Broken Steel because it
Sure.
So we actually have more members of our team in the audience, some of whom are better Fallout experts, so I'm going to source this out to Dan.
Hi, how's it going? I'm severely underdressed, but my thoughts on Broken Steel especially are like, that to me seemed more like a situation in which the developers sort of realized a mistake they had made, which was not letting you continue to play the game when it was over. And so I think that sometimes DLC, particularly in the Fallout series, now that we're seeing, almost is more corrective than completing something, especially in Fallout 3's case. Although I will say that the Pit is an example where it's not like that at all, where it's actually trying to sort of broaden the scope of the story and add more story to it. So I think, like what Aaron is talking about with Bloodborne, or rather with Dark Souls 2, that's a situation where like the base game was complete and then the DLC added to it and sort of retroactively made you understand the base game. Whereas with Fallout 3 and Fallout 4 has some issues with this too. It feels more like a tacked on, like, oh, we forgot to do this, or sorry, we didn't add this, that kind of thing. So, thank you.
Thank you.
And I'll add this, I mean, it's certainly a good thing, I guess, that DLC in general can be used to patch bad stories in a certain way. You know, it's better than just having the story stay incomplete, right? But, you know, you would hope that on the one hand, right, the story was actually compelling in the first place and that didn't have to happen, and on the other hand, DLC ends up evolving into just this expected thing for any new game, which seems to be the way that things are going. It has some value to stand on its own rather than just being used as a tool for developers to say, it's okay if we don't get everything right and really compelling the first time, we can always rectify it in the DLC. That's kind of scary to me. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Matt Galati, and I was wondering about this idea of DLC subverting our interest in expanding the story. I'm wondering how much mileage the medium can get out of that idea. Because I can also interpret your Dark Souls example as perhaps a critique of DLC, because it is unnatural that we want to continue this.
That's a really great point, and I agree with you. I do think it's a critique. You know, I think the motivation behind wanting DLC, like I said, is kind of perverse, right? And I think why the DLC succeeds is precisely because it captures that perverse nature of it, right? Maybe that'll only be interesting for so long, but I mean, look, I personally think you could say the same thing about, you know, the numerous games that subvert things like linear storytelling in video games, right? Think about like BioShock, right? Is a great example of this. You know, that was sort of, even if it wasn't one of the first, it's one of the best known and certainly one of the most popular critiques of what it is to actually like guide an avatar through a game and make decisions or not make decisions, right? But I think if you look at the landscape of games since the first BioShock, a lot of other games have been doing really interesting things that you could put in that same camp of like a kind of basic critique of what it is to play a video game. So I recognize that could definitely be a limitation on the value of DLC, but I think that if we see it as at least one way to get value out of it, the more DLC focuses on it, the more nuanced that critique could become, and thereby the more interesting it would be.
Fair enough, thank you.
Thanks.
Hey, I'm Connor. All right, so you guys have gone through a lot of video game stories. What are your personal favorites?
I love this question. Someone else do it.
So I'll jump through real quick. As far as video game storytelling goes, I always lean back from Majora's Mask. I really love the way the storytelling evolves in that one. But a lot of games that I'm more interested in recently are games like Beginner's Guide. I don't know if you've ever played that one. I was thinking of the same guy that created Stanley Parable, which is another great example of interesting and unique storytelling in video games. Beginner's Guide is really cool because it becomes very, very complex relationship in your role in the story and in the narrator's role in the story. So it's a very unique thing. It's one of the reasons it's my favorite.
Right? It's not linear. It just makes you do like all these different side quests that are actually part of the main quest, but you get to explore this whole world because of it. And I really like that because I really like Darksiders 2 in all its capacity.
I'm really into games like, I used to be really into games like Dragon Age and Mass Effect just because I'm basic and I really like character-driven stories. And I especially love the way that Mass Effect introduced huge concepts that were intended to just be scary because of the sheer like size of the concept. I'm also a big fan of like Fallout, for instance, because Fallout does similar style stories, but because of the style of the game, they also leave a lot of in-between space where you can sort of inject your own understanding and just project yourself into the story.
So if you don't know the history of the site, as the name suggests, it was actually born to be analyzing the Majora's Mask for 3 months. So that is a special place in my heart, and I think it's a story that's still like criminally underappreciated, even for all the appreciation that people have gotten for it. I love it. I think it's great. I think it's one of the smartest things that's been released in any storytelling medium in a long time. I also love the Xenoblade series. I've written a lot about it. I think it does really good things with integrating philosophy into games in a way that enriches the story rather than just is sort of a set piece for the story. And more recently, I played Prey recently, and I thought I would hate it, but I thought it was really smart at the end in a way that I think needs to be discussed more since it's just so new. Thank you. All right, gang, thank you so much for your time. We got the time signal, so those of you who have questions, whether you wind up or not, like I said, we're really just going to be right outside the room. We want to talk to you, so let's do that. If you want to head out, like I said, we've got stickers and cards up here. If you want to keep in touch, just check us out online. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you had fun with this, and I hope you have a great PAX. Thanks, guys.